What I'd like to do in this brief video is introduce a source analysis scaffold that I've adapted mainly with the new modern history core topic, power and authority in the modern world, in mind, but I think you could use this scaffold in a broader range of circumstances as well. What I've done is published a brief article in the Teaching History Journal, which is the journal of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. And it's in the September 2018 edition of that journal on pages 45 to 47. And basically what you get is a very brief introduction to this scaffold. You get one version of the scaffold with some guiding questions to help you work with it. And you get a blank version, which is exactly the same as that one you can see on your screen there, with some blank space where you can actually write your notes and write your ideas about the sources that you might be working with. And before we launch into an investigation or an analysis of that scaffold, what I want to quickly do is just briefly recap on what it is that we're trying to achieve with source analysis. Basically, in history, the aim is to get to a stage where we can communicate ideas about the past. To clarify that one step further, what I think we are trying to do in history is develop good ideas about the past or strong ideas about the past. In other words, we're trying to develop and make claims about the past that are believable and that have some evidence basis to them. And to do that, we have to work with source material. In modern history, we're lucky because we have a very, very wide variety, often anyway, a very wide variety of source material that we can actually draw upon. So we can look to things like documents, photographs, maps, statistics, diaries, whatever we can find to use in our history. But historians don't just grab that material and put it into their history. They actually go through often a very lengthy process of analysis and interrogation and investigation to try and ensure that what they're drawing into their history and what they're basing their claims about the past on are actually very strong and dependable. And the scaffold that I'm presenting here is really designed to help you with that analysis and interrogation and investigation. There are many different ways to do historical source analysis. This is one option. So I'm not suggesting this is the only way, but it's just one, I think, intelligent way to start thinking about source material, particularly in the context of this topic. What I think we want to do before we begin even working with the source material that we have or what we find based upon our research is to make sure that we have a clear investigation in mind. So what I mean by this is that we have a clear question to answer. So we're not just analyzing sources for no reason. We're trying to bring sources to, we're trying to use sources to perhaps answer a question about history or perhaps solve a problem. We might have come across a kind of a mystery, you might say, in the topic that we're working on, and we're trying to use sources to perhaps solve that. Or finally, we might have come across a claim about the past, a claim about an event or a person, and it may not necessarily strike us as true. And so what we need to then do is think about gathering some sources that might help us to assess or evaluate that particular claim. This happens quite a lot. When you're reading a book or something like that, and a historian might make a claim that just doesn't seem right, and you think, I need to go away and do my own research on this. Well, this is where your sources come in. And what I'm saying here is that I think it's really important before you even work with sources to have a clear idea of what you're actually aiming to answer or solve or evaluate before you even get going, because that will help you understand how to actually interpret and analyze the sources as you work with them. In the simplest setting, in an exam, you're often just given the question or the problem and you're given the sources. So that's quite clear. But if we're working with our own research, then it's really important to make sure that we have a clear aim in mind for when we do this. Now, the scaffold is quite simple. It's basically got 4 parts. Firstly, it's asking you to observe and source. And in this case, source, the word there, source, basically means to look for evidence of the origins of the particular material that you're working with. So put this in a maybe a funny expression, what is the source of the source? Where did it come from? Who created it? And so on. Secondly, you're being asked to look at the context and the perspective of the source. Thirdly, to test and corroborate the source. And finally, to assess and evaluate the source and hopefully get to a point where you can see clearly how you might use it for your investigation. So let's pick each of these off one by one and look at them in a bit more detail. Firstly, when you're observing and sourcing, what you're aiming to do here is to identify some of the most basic features of the source. So a couple of questions that you might pose at this stage: what do you notice within or about the source? So this might involve basically you looking at, say, a photograph, where you look at the photograph and you consider what you can notice within the source. What is prominent in the photograph? What's in the background? What is being portrayed in the photograph? But also, this question is asking you to think about what you notice about the source. Are there any labels attached to the source? Any annotations perhaps, or captions that might come with a photograph that tell you when it was created, who created it, maybe some of the circumstances under which it was created? Noticing those issues about the source are often as important as noticing what is within the source itself. To put this another way, basically what you're doing is you're thinking about the key features of the source. What are the key features that you can notice immediately about this? And we can come back to this often, as you go through your analysis, you come back and you notice other things about the source, but it is a good place to start. Just very simply, what I'm getting at here, let's go back to the photograph example. You're asking really simple questions. Who took the picture? What's featured in the image? What message do you think is the photographer trying to communicate perhaps? What reaction are they trying to get from the image? What are they trying to achieve? It's really basic questions so that you can begin your wider analysis. Secondly, we move on to thinking about the context and the perspective. And the aim here is to try to determine what was taking place at the time the source was created, and also to consider how that may have influenced the source's meaning and perspective. So a couple of questions you might ask at this stage are, what do you know about the context that the source was created in? Let's go back to, again, the photograph example. If there might be an annotation that comes along with it saying that the photograph was created in 1934 in Berlin, for example, in Germany. Well, what do we know about what was taking place at that time? And does that actually help us think about what the source might be, what the source might mean, and also what the perspective might be? Second question, how might the context have shaped the meaning of the source? Can you make a link? And this is not always easy, but is there links to be made between the context and the meaning? This often takes some thinking, and often, hopefully you're given some extra information in your annotations to help you do this. And thirdly, I've put an important question there, and that is, we're trying to get to a point here where we can start to say something about the perspective of the source. Now, this involves at least two things, I think. One is being able to comment on what the source is saying about the topic, or what its interpretation of the topic might be. But it's also asking you to think about the position from which that interpretation is being made. So it's both of those things. It's what's being claimed, but it's also what position that claim is being made from. Both very important things in considering, I think, the perspective of a source. Third job that we have is to begin to test and corroborate. And I think this is where the scaffold begins to get quite complicated. So what we're aiming to do here is compare and contrast the source that we're working with to others that we may have seen before or analyzed before, or actually compare and contrast it to the evidence we already have in our own memory and knowledge, and then begin to think about how that may impact our understanding of the reliability of the source. So a couple of questions that you might ask at this stage when you're looking at the source is, how does it fit with other material or information that you already know of or have already seen? So this might be the case that you, say you've come across a photograph of Nazi Germany, and you have just analyzed the number of photographs recently. Does this photograph fit comfortably with those other images, or is it quite different? Does it add something different to what you've already discussed so far? That may be a good thing. But in some cases, if we see a source that's quite different, it might also make us ask a few extra questions about it. So this a second question that I think is important is perhaps does other evidence that you already have support or challenge the source? This, I think, can be quite a useful question if you're working with, say, a document where, say, an author is making some claims about a particular event, and those claims seem quite exaggerated, perhaps, to you. What you're doing there is you're starting to draw on your own knowledge to begin to corroborate the source. Now, if it's feeling a little exaggerated, of course you'd want to go and do a bit of extra research and check whether that's the case. But in some cases, your own knowledge and the evidence that you already know can be a good place to start for testing and corroborating a source. Thirdly, and this is really important, I think, is that we get to a point where we can ask the extent to which we think the source is reliable for the purposes of our particular inquiry. Let's just pause here quickly and think about an example, because it comes up often, particularly in the study of things like war and Nazi Germany and dictatorships like Stalin's Russia and so on. The issue of propaganda is what I'm thinking of here. And we know that a lot of propaganda that was developed in wartime and under the dictatorships was very exaggerated. The posters, think of the posters at this stage, how they represent a very exaggerated image of the supposed enemies of the state in those contexts. Well, those depictions of the supposed enemies of the state may not be very reliable in terms of their factual depiction of those people or those groups, but they're quite reliable in helping us understand the nature of the governments and the strategies of the governments to actually attack those people. So depending on our purpose, our judgment of the reliability of those sources might shift. So I think it's really key to go back to what we said at the beginning, towards the beginning of the video. We said it's really important to have a clear idea of what you're trying to investigate in mind as you're analyzing sources. And finally, we want to get to a point where we can start to assess and evaluate the source. This is kind of you might say, the big picture part of the scaffold, where you begin to make some overall judgments about the source. And that might be about what evidence you think it contains. It might be about the value of the source, but also it might be about the limitations of the source and the problems it actually poses. So a couple of questions that I think are relevant here. What is the value of the source to your current investigation? So you want to make a judgment about the value that it provides for your particular investigation. The flip side of that, if you want, is what are the limitations of the source to your current investigation? Often you'll find that sources have both value and limitations. They're not 100% valuable and they're not 100% invaluable. They're often a mix of the two. So it's worth thinking about both of those questions together. And then getting more specific here, we're asking in this third question how we might use the source as evidence. Okay, so this is where we get to that point where, as I said at the beginning, the aim of history is often to get to a point where we can make some claims about the past. We want to do that based upon sources. Well, here's the specific question. How can we use this particular source as evidence? And we want to get specific. We can use it as evidence of X or Y, but not necessarily of some other issues over here. So again, that will depend on the purpose of your inquiry and the main idea that you are trying to explore, or the main question you're trying to answer. So just quickly in summary, the point here is that in history, we're trying to get to a point where you can communicate ideas about the past. We need to reach back into source material to do this. And to do that intelligently, we need to analyze, interrogate, and investigate that material. And the scaffold that I've offered here is one way to do that. I've already suggested that there's plenty of other ways to do it, but I think this is a useful way to begin working with source material, particularly in a modern history context.